Welcome, witches. As per usual, I might be a little bit late jumping on the trend, but I've been watching a lot of icebergs lately, and I have to admit they have kind of inspired me to do an iceberg breakdown video of my own. I've talked about horror movies a lot on this channel, I've talked about disturbing movies a lot on this channel, so what better iceberg to break down than the horror movie slash disturbing movie Iceberg? This one comes to us from Reddit user Nice Guy Phil, and I know that this is an iceberg that has been broken down on YouTube before by some really talented YouTubers like Windigoon and Nick's Fears. But with my own interpretation, my own background, my own research, I did think that there was some stuff that I could add to this iceberg breakdown, and if you want to go check out those videos, then those are very valuable too. Those all have their own interpretation, their own backgrounds. Definitely check those out after this if you enjoy what I'm doing here today. I have watched all of the movies that we're talking about today. As we're gonna go down further on the iceberg, we are gonna get to a point where I have not seen the movies just because it's impossible. Some of these are only available on the dark web, and that's a place that I'm just not gonna go, not because I'm scared, just because I can't be honestly. Without further ado, let's talk a little bit more about what an iceberg is. Think about the way that an iceberg would work. Above the water, you have everything visible, everything obvious. So in this situation, it would be everything that a fan would know. But as we go further down on the iceberg, we get into more and more niche knowledge until it gets to a point where you're just like, what the I think that's probably enough introduction, so without further ado, let's get into the top tier of this iceberg, which is all the stuff that I think that as a horror movie fan, you should probably know. Friday the 13th. So basically, Friday the 13th was an attempt to capitalize on the success of Halloween by giving us another silent stalker that's kind of kept in the shadows, all based around the theme of a holiday. The way that Friday the 13th really changed the game was by adding a lot more gore and a lot more Tom Savini, who did the special effects for this movie, came from a World War II background. So he was very familiar with the way that gore realistically worked, and he was able to incorporate that into the special effects of this movie. That's probably the reason why the gore effects were really impactful back when the movie first came out, but admittedly, Friday the 13th is kind of one of those movies that's been ripped off again and again and again so many times that at this point when you go back, first of all, it's not that unique of a story anymore, and second of all, the gore effects have been kind of dated at this point. Even though Tom Savini is still a master, you can kind of tell that it's a little fake. Nonetheless, the gore effects in that movie really changed the game for horror, so full respect. Child's Play. Child's Play is actually based on the true story of Robert the doll. So the story was that there was this little boy that just became absolutely obsessed with his doll, and it got to the point where he was blaming the doll for little mischiefs that would happen around the house. And even into adulthood, he was still obsessed with this doll, and he would keep it in the window of his house, and the children of the neighborhood would just kind of walk by and talk about how they would see Robert the doll staring at them from this window and how creepy it was, and how they would swear that the doll would move from window to window. All of this, it's the true story, and it's what inspired Child's Play. While the sequels would inevitably reach a horror comedy place, the first movie was more of an excuse to capitalize on the fear of dolls. That being said, Child's Play did come to be negatively associated in the media at the time due to the murder of Suzanne Capper, a 16-year-old girl from Manchester, England, who was horrifically tortured along to the song "Hi, I'm Chucky, Wanna Play" by 150 volts. And her abusers would often begin torture sessions by telling her Chucky's coming to play. As much as the movie never could have anticipated this event happening, it did slow down their ability to produce sequels for a while because people really blamed the movies, as they saw this case as justifying their early fears that the inclusion of dolls in this movie would somehow corrupt children. Scream. Created by Wes Craven, whose movies actually appear on this list several times, this movie is something of a horror parody within a horror movie. It follows follows generally the same rules of a slasher movie while simultaneously inverting them and mocking them, which is fun. But similar to Child's Play, after the release of this movie, there were a string of violent attacks perpetrated mainly by teenagers that the media blamed on this movie. And in this case, I can understand why, maybe a little bit more. Scream does directly open up a dialogue about whether or not violent movies create violence. Rather, this movie takes the stance that while horror movies may, unfortunately, serve as a guide for real-life violent attacks, they do not cause them. Rather, these violent attacks would have happened whether the movie existed or not, because it was not the movie that made them disturbed enough to do this. More often than not, these are people who are dealing with much deeper issues, and who are not given access to the proper support and services to be able to work through them. And so they turn to violence, but that isn't the fault of violent media. Plenty of people do turn to violent media without ever expressing violent tendencies, like Randy in Scream. And perhaps the fact that this movie focuses on both sides is part of the appeal. It feels dangerous because the movie is violent, so you're playing on that fear that maybe, just maybe, you might be a little bit like Billy.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
But the reality is that you're Randy, boring everyone with your useless horror movie facts that you got because you watched my video, I guess.
Oh my God, Randy, I thought you were dead.
I probably should be. I never thought I'd be so happy to be a virgin.
Insidious. Insidious is actually a franchise of horror movies produced by James Wan, which deals with a little boy who slips into the astral plane and ends up inviting a demonic haunting into his house. Oops. James Wan did become famous for creating the Saw franchise, but the Insidious franchise seems to be his more commercially successful series, perhaps because it's a much gentler and easier watch in general. The Conjuring. Another supernatural James Wan franchise, this one following the supposedly true stories of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who claim to be demonologists, but to my understanding, they've been proven to be con artists. So I do have a hard time taking these movies seriously, but I guess if you just consider them like cute little ghost stories, they're fine. Annabelle. This is another James Wan, Ed and Lorraine Warren movie. This one focused on the supposedly true story of Annabelle, which is a much more sensational haunted doll story than Robert the Doll, but of course it is. Ed and Lorraine Warren needed to sell tickets to their museum. The Ring. Based on the 1998 Ringu, which introduced Sadako as a Japanese yurei, or a vengeful ghost, who kills anyone who watches a haunted videotape. The Ring was an American remake that really brought the franchise into the mainstream. It was so popular that in the early 2000s it caused a surge of American remakes of Asian horror movies. But the thing about The Ring that I think sticks with everyone the most is just the imagery, particularly the way that the ghost moves just seems to make an impression on people. This movie is just gorgeously shot in the most grotesque way, and I can't deny that I love it. A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is the second appearance of Wes Craven on this Iceberg, and this movie has one of the most terrifying concepts in all of horror. Freddy Krueger is a monster that kills you in your dreams. So that leaves you with two options. You can either fall asleep and die, or you cannot fall asleep, go slowly insane, eventually fall asleep anyway, and then die. There's a level of inescapability to Freddy that makes him really threatening, and then on top of that, the movie has like a million sequels, so even when you're done, you still can't get away from him. Wes Craven was actually inspired to write the movie after reading about this weird epidemic for some reason that could never be fully explained. There were all of these cases in the 80s where, in particular, men in their 20s and 30s who had all recently immigrated out of Laos, which is in Southeast Asia for anyone who isn't aware. These were refugees fleeing from war at the time, and yet when they came to the States, for some reason, they developed this fear of going to sleep. It just got to this point where they were convinced that if they fell to sleep, then they would die. So they avoided sleep at absolutely all costs until they inevitably fell asleep and died in real life. There's never been an explanation. We don't know why that happened. The realm of dreams is so misunderstood. There's so much to it that anything could be possible. It's just, why not throw out a dream demon? It's just a fun idea and it's terrifying. The Grudge. This is one of those American remakes to an Asian horror movie that I mentioned previously. The original movie being Ju-on. Ju-on follows the story of the Saiki family after the patriarch of the family murdered his wife and son in a jealous rage before then dying by. These events cause a terrible imprint on the house that haunts and eventually kills anyone who encounters it. It was a very unique take on a haunted house story, prioritizing the setting over any individual protagonist. But that did mean that they just kind of threw away the traditional Hollywood format for Ju-on. So the remake had a really difficult time balancing, adapting the story that they were given and giving audiences something a little closer to what they expected. What did seem to attract American audiences was the imagery of Kayako crawling across the floor as a result of her broken spine, as well as that death rattle that she gives off. We're moving down the iceberg now, so it's time for a slightly darker shade of lipstick. I don't know, I just thought that would be slightly fun to distract from all of the disgusting things that we're about to see. So tier 2 I've labeled as sort of the splatter films of the group. These are movies that maybe a casual viewer might not have seen, but hey, if you love horror, you've probably seen these. First up, we have Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Known as one of the original slasher movies, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre follows a group of young people traveling through Texas when they get taken in by a family of cannibals. The movie claimed to be based on a true story when it first came out, and although the character of Leatherface is loosely inspired by real-life grave robber Ed Gein, the actual events of the movie are entirely fiction. But this claim to truth drew in a much wider audience at the time, and to be fair, there is a grittiness to the movie that does make it feel very real, and that gets really disturbing when what you're watching is people wander through rooms that actually look like they've been decorated by a serial killer, and then they get hoisted heavily onto meat hooks. And the look of pain in the actors' eyes is often like genuine pain too, because the actors were not at all provided for or cared for on the set, I'll just say that. As extreme as everything gets in this movie, it never does start to feel unrealistic, because Tobe Hooper was trying to speak to the state of the world at the time. He felt that the government was lying to the masses and pushing forward brutality over sentimentality. So he utilized his anger around events like Watergate and the Vietnam War to explore the sort of violence that he felt that the media was just constantly reporting on at the time. The Hills Have Eyes. The Hills Have Eyes is another cannibal movie, this one set in the Nevada wilderness, and it follows a family on vacation who end up getting taken in by another family, this one of cannibals. Similar to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this is supposed to be another comment on class in America, with our survivor family intending to represent the bourgeoisie, and the cannibal family intending to represent our collective desire to eat the rich. The most disturbing scene in the movie, however, is one where the cannibal family crucifies the father of the survivor's family, and then they set the cross on fire, all to distract from the fact that one of the cannibals is one of their daughters in the trailer. Saw. Some people refer to this as one of the most important movies in the torture subgenre. Some people prefer the term splatter film, but either way, you get the point. This movie is all about gore. This franchise follows the character John Kramer, a terminal cancer patient who envies those who take their life for granted. And so he builds elaborate torture devices for them to escape from in the hopes that this will encourage them to, appreciate what they already had. One thing that I do appreciate about Saw is that it takes the subtext of what we, or at least I, really appreciate about these disturbing movies and turns it into text. I have realized that one of the reasons why I enjoy these movies is because it makes me appreciate my life a little bit more. It makes me aware of the horrendous pain that definitely does exist in this world. And it makes me take a moment to appreciate all of the freedoms and all of the opportunities that I still have access to, because just a simple twist of fate didn't place me in such a horrible spot. Saw actively asks you to appreciate your life, all while you're watching this horrible depravity on screen. So perhaps that is a reason why this movie was able to break into a mainstream audience a little bit easier than a lot of other movies in this subgenre. Tusk. Tusk was supposed to be the first movie in Kevin Smith's True North trilogy, which was going to be this whole trilogy of horror movies set in my home country of Canada, but as it is, we're still waiting on the third one. Moose Jaws. But the thing about Tusk that seems to make it stand out in a lot of people's minds is that it's about a crazy person who literally performs surgery on Justin Long's body to turn him into a walrus. It is sort of a fun example of body horror, but more than anything, I think we all know how this script came about.
For me, weed creates time.
House of a Thousand Corpses. I'm actually kind of surprised that they put House of a Thousand Corpses on this list instead of The Devil's Rejects, but I guess it is the first movie, so I'll allow it. House of a Thousand Corpses is really a love letter to movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it is really fun for that, just feeling like a more polished version of that movie. But Rob Zombie was a first-time director back then, and even he's admitted that there's some things that he would change about that movie. The Devil's Rejects was the sequel, and it really did amp everything up to like 11. It just has more torture, more gritty scenes, and the thing that I think I appreciate more than anything, a more ambiguous take on the subject of good and evil. There is something very likable about the Firefly family, and that's both the fun and the horror of these movies. You like the villains. You don't want to like the villains, so what's wrong with you? Hostel. This movie was brought to us by Eli Roth, who was hugely influenced by some directors that we're going to talk about on the next tier, so there's that. It follows a group of American tourists who get kidnapped and tortured by a secret society of elite businessmen while they're on vacation in Eastern Europe. It very much does play on this fear of being stuck in an unfamiliar country with an unfamiliar language and culture. But we also get that good old-fashioned class struggle that seems to be a theme in this Iceberg. In the end, we're all just hunting fodder to the rich. It's pessimistic and the torture is hard to watch. But I have to admit, Eli Roth definitely knows his way around a splatter film. The Human Centipede. This movie gained public interest due to its absolute just insane concept. So it follows this mad scientist who kidnaps 3 people with the intention of turning them into a human centipede, which means that he sews them together, mouth to butt. That's pretty much all this movie has going for it, but if you were to venture further on into the sequels, oh boy, that's all I'll say for now. Midsummer. Ari Aster is really good for giving us horror movies that aren't really horror movies. They're more like dramas, exploring human relationships through a horror lens. On the one hand, this is the story of a girl who finds the strength to overcome an unfulfilling relationship and find her place amongst a community that accepts her. On the other hand, it's the story of a vulnerable young woman who gets drawn in by a cult. The movie kind of tries to balance it both ways, the former perspective being hers and the latter perspective being his. And I do have to admit, the way that this movie balances both sides is really masterful. So now we're on tier 3. And tier 3 I've labeled art or exploitation. The reason why I've chosen to label it that way is that some of these movies are just straight out exploitation, and there's just no argument about that. But some of these movies, there is the argument that they are art and that the extremes that they go to are justified for the purposes of art. So we'll go through that as we go. Salo, or 120 Days of Sodom. So this movie is absolutely disgusting, and there's no denying that, but this is one of the movies on this tier that some people have an argument might count as art. It's based on an unfinished book by the Marquis de Sade, who, if you want to know a little bit more about, I did talk about in this video here. But basically, to summarize, he was a French nobleman who gained a little bit of a reputation for writing just extremely violent, as well as for his real-life violent, to the point that his name is literally where we get the word sadism from. The book 120 Days of Sodom was about 4 French libertines. But when Pier Paolo Pasolini set out to make the movie, he changed the setting to Nazi-occupied Salo, Italy. A change that was so important that it actually preceded the title of the novel. In the movie, 4 Italian noblemen agree to marry one another's 4 daughters. And to celebrate the wedding, they kidnap 9 young girls and 9 young boys, and then hire a bunch of guards to keep an eye on them. And then they proceed to have what the Marquis de Sade would call a weekend. Most of the violence is psychological in nature, with just a little bit of physical violence thrown in and some forced feeding, with the whole thing ending in a massacre. It's pretty incessant and hard to watch, but the reason why some people defend it as art is because it's intended to be read as a comment on the way that power can corrupt the upper class and lead them to commit horrible acts against the masses. And when you add that theme onto the fact that Pasolini changed the setting to Nazi-occupied Salo, there definitely is an argument about how you could only effectively communicate the specific message that Pasolini had in mind by going to such extremes. It's uncomfortable to watch, but that's the point. Watching what is essentially Nazis, or at the very least people who benefit from Nazis, torture the masses should never be comfortable. I would never go as far as to say that I like the movie, but I can't deny that I do respect it a little bit. Martyrs. Martyrs is the most famous movie in the new French extremity movement, which in the absolute laziest summary possible, you can sort of think of it as the French equivalent to the American torture boom in the early 2000s. One major way that the new French extremity movement differs from torture, however, is that the former cares a lot about the difference between pain and suffering. Pain being a more contained feeling, whereas suffering is deeper and more prolonged. This theme is hugely important to Martyrs, which is all about the difference between pain and suffering. Essentially, the villains of Martyrs are this secret community that are trying to find evidence of the afterlife. And their method for doing this is kidnapping and torturing young girls until they reach the point of pure suffering, usually achieved at the moment just before death. At which point, these girls are supposed to catch a glimpse of the afterlife with just enough time to repeat what they're seeing back to the secret community of people. The only problem with this is that true suffering is difficult to achieve, so they have to push these girls to some pretty devastating extremes to do that. It's an extremely pessimistic movie. Pascal Laugier himself admitted that he was dealing with clinical depression when he wrote the script, and yeah, you can really tell. Shoujo Tsubaki. Also known as Midori, this animated movie follows the tradition of the shoujo Tsubaki, or the camellia girl, which is a popular trope of Japanese street theater. Usually this trope deals with some poor child who goes on to work in a circus after their parents die. And yeah, this is more or less the plot to Midori. In the movie, Midori is a poor child who gets lured in to work at a carnival after her mother passes away. And while she works at this carnival, she faces constant and emotional abuse. Her only respite proves to be a grown man who grooms Midori into marrying him, at which point he becomes extremely possessive and even abusive towards her. One scene that really hit me directly in the heart, however, is the ending. After watching her suffer this constant abuse, we see Midori left completely alone. And in this moment, she just cries. And honestly, the sounds of her cries are just like so childlike, it's horrible. Like, it's horrible to think of all of this happening to a child. It's horrible to think about where she could possibly go from this point forward. It's horrible to think that her story isn't even really fiction, because this sort of abuse happens to children every day. There's also some animal abuse in the movie, but it is all animated, so if that bothers you now, it's gonna get a lot worse going on from here. The animation in this movie is gorgeous, but yeah, the content is pretty hard to watch. Pink Flamingos. John Waters is a real artist, okay? As much as his movies weren't always the most enjoyable to watch, he was always trying to push the envelope of what was considered acceptable. And that includes working with absolute Queen Divine, who is in this movie, and that's why I can't say anything bad about it. I will, however, describe the movie and let that speak for itself. So Divine is the matriarch of this family who has been labeled the filthiest people alive, for reasons that will soon become clear. But there's also this other couple out there who are competing against Divine to take that title from her. The Crayon couple attempt to do this by kidnapping women, holding them in their basement, and then stealing their babies so that they can sell them to lesbian couples. Divine, meanwhile, is busy having with her son, committing cannibalism, and eating dog off the street. And yes, Divine actually did that last one for this movie. Do not let her sacrifice be in vain by forgetting her name.
Filth are my politics. Filth is my life. Take whatever you like.
It isn't a movie that I particularly enjoy watching, but it is a movie that I forced my spouse to watch with me after one of my best friends forced me to watch it with her, so that has to mean something. Yes, you're starting to realize how all this happens. It's just this big social chain of people bullying each other into watching these movies and then calling each other friends. A Serbian film. A Serbian film follows a former adult film star who's approached to do one last movie, with the promise that doing so will provide for his wife and son forever. But once he gets to set, he discovers that the movie is not only more violent than he expected, it also involves having this little girl watch him perform these violent acts against her own mother. When he tries to leave the movie, the director responds by putting on this videotape where a woman gives birth and then a man takes the baby away, and let's just say that he takes that newborn and makes some cheese pizza. But also no, it doesn't make any more sense in context as to why he's showing him this video. Our protagonist then tries to run away, at which point he's drugged and forced to continue performing violent acts against multiple people, including a woman who he ends up murdering during, and then two masked bodies that he later discovers to be his own wife and son. There is an argument about whether or not this movie counts as art or simple exploitation, mostly because the director of this movie claimed that he only went to such extremes because he wanted to present the reality of modern day Serbia. But no, I don't think anything justifies this. The Human Centipede 2. The Human Centipede 2 is set in a universe where the first movie is just a movie, and it follows a man who not only wants to recreate the Human Centipede, he wants to outdo it, so he kidnaps 12 people to do this. The first movie prided itself on being medically accurate, which technically means that if you were sick enough to perform this surgery, then your patients might not die right away. Unless it was from shame. But the side effect of this whole thing was that the first movie just felt a little bit too clean, whereas the sequel gives you surgery performed by that creepy guy who leers at you in the hallway, and it really does feel that way. Pretty much every horrible thing that you can imagine happens in this sequel. There's also mentions of childhood abuse throughout the whole movie that can be extremely triggering. Yeah, basically this was just a franchise that was just obsessed with getting worse and worse as time went on. Cannibal Holocaust. Cannibal Holocaust is sort of like one of the original found footage movies, and it was so realistic that people actually thought it was real at the time. The movie follows this one man trying to figure out what happened to a team of journalists who went missing in the Amazon rainforest. He discovers their tapes amongst a tribe of suspected cannibals. But when he returns home to review the footage, he discovers that the journalists were actually tormenting the natives and actually burning down their houses in order to get more sensationalized footage. The journalists take things too far when they rape a native girl. And the next time that we see her, she's been impaled on a giant stake. The journalists do mention that the natives here kill survivors, but it's also implied that they may have been the ones to kill the girl themselves in an attempt to make the natives look worse in their footage. In retaliation, the natives kill and eat the journalists, leaving the whole movie on this question of who the real savages are, which is really racist, I'm sorry. Like, can we just not imply that anyone who isn't from our culture is immediately primitive and backwards? The main reason why this movie inspired controversy, however, was that many people thought that it was a real snuff film. Basically, the director Deodato wanted the movie to feel as real as possible. So he intentionally sought out unknown actors and then had them sign a contract agreeing to not appear in any media. No commercials, no movies, nothing, for at least a year after the movie's release. And some of the deaths in Cannibal Holocaust were real. The animal deaths, which are extremely horrific to watch. So between the two things, rumors started to circulate that Deodato had actually murdered his actors, and he was arrested and charged with both obscenity and murder. In order to prove that the actors were still alive, he had to get in contact with them and have them present themselves in court. But even when you get past all the snuff film accusations, there's just so much in this movie that is really disturbing. Like, especially the violence against women in this movie is extreme, and we really can't forget the fact that Deodato actually murdered animals for this movie, not to mention mistreated the native actors and may or may not have mistreated the Italian actors on set as well. Tetsuo the Iron Man. This is a body horror movie about a man whose body starts to literally turn into metal, and that's pretty much all that I have to say about it. More than anything, this movie is just really gory and then really weird because of the way that it's shot. Like, really, it's just this weird, gory little art piece that plays on your fear of machines overtaking humanity. Club. Club is about a detective in Japan who's investigating a string of mass, which he eventually connects back to this band that's been influencing these kids to do this. It's really gory because you can imagine the bloodbath that would be caused by 54 teenage girls getting hit by a train all at once. But I do think that the other movies on this tier made me expect a little bit more from this movie. Mostly it's just really gory, and I do understand that the topic of can be disturbing. I just don't feel like it was handled in a way that I could personally relate to it. I do know that Japan takes a very different understanding to than my country of Canada does, so I don't know if that might have been a barrier in my understanding of the movie. The House That Jack Built. The House That Jack Built is a Lars von Trier movie, and if you know anything about Lars von Trier, then you know why you should stay away from this movie. It's another art film that plays with the ideas presented in Dante's Inferno, the whole movie being told in retrospect as a serial killer recounts his life from hell. It includes scenes like a woman being forced to picnic with her son's corpses. But I honestly think that the scene that disturbs me most in this movie is just when one of Jack's victims manages to escape him and get to the police, only for Jack to catch up to them and convince the police that she's just making everything up and drunk, at which point the police actually return her to her murderer's care. I don't think that this would disturb me so much if it wasn't for the fact that I know this happens in real life. I mean, for instance, just look at the case of 14-year-old Konorak Synthansamphone. This young boy did manage to escape from the apartment of Jeffrey Dahmer, and he managed to get the attention of a couple of police officers. But when Jeffrey Dahmer caught up to them, he was able to convince the officers that not only was this literal child his 18-year-old boyfriend, but that he was drunk and just ran out into the streets and bloody. And if you were wondering, yes, the officers returned this boy to Jeffrey Dahmer's care, and yes, he was unfortunately murdered shortly thereafter. As much as I definitely understand that these sorts of movies are not for everyone, and I would never try to suggest otherwise, I do think that there's something significant about scenes like this because it reminds us that these things do happen. And it's important to be aware of that, just so that we can, think a little bit more about taking victims seriously. Otherwise, this is just another gory horror movie that sets out to explore the mind of a serial killer, which I do feel is a little bit of a trope at this point, but it is very disturbing, so hey. That's gonna be it for our video today. We will be continuing this Iceberg in another video, just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek at some of the titles that we've got coming. We've got Slaughtered Vomit Dolls. I've referenced that on this channel before. Can't wait to actually explain to you guys what that is. And then we've got a few favorites for this channel. We've got Necromantic and Where the Dead Go to Die. And August Underground, look at that! Some good old-fashioned things that we've seen here before. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss out on part 2 of this video, then make sure to click that subscribe button and the little bell thingy. And on that note, I will see you guys next time. If you were to go down to the description box, you would find the Amazon link to my book, Poor Pretty Creature, available wherever you can find ebooks. And while I'm still here, although it is completely unnecessary to donate, I do understand that a lot of people are struggling financially right now. I did just want to mention that I have a Patreon which will be linked below, as well as give thanks to the people who already support me there. Andre K, Scott Falks, Thrill House, and Wilson L. Ricks III. Donations can be as little as $1 a month, but as I said, absolutely no pressure whatsoever. Your support means the world to me, but so does the support of every single person who gives a like or a comment or even just a view. And I can't wait to see you all next time.